Trojan Nation, it finally happened. Clay Helton is out the door, and you're looking for a new head coach, the one who would lead you to the promised land as outlined by the expectations of the athletic director, the administration, and the fan base, of course, that USC would get back to the prominence of the elite of college football. We got Matt Zemek on the line from Trojans Wire to help us talk about USC football, the demise of Clay Helton, and what the future could bring. Matt, appreciate you stopping by.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Great to be on your program.
Thank you. So Clay Helton has done just enough to keep his job. Basically, had been the case. So the highlights were, of course, a Rose Bowl win in 2016 that culminated a long winning streak after a slow start in which they were decidedly the best team in the Pac-12 at that point. Even though they didn't win the title, they win the Rose Bowl. It seems to have been linked to a number of excellent recruiting classes that seem to surge the program onto that next level. Sam Darnold was back for 2017. They do win the Pac-12, but there were those issues in trying to compete with the big programs like Ohio State and Notre Dame in non-conference play. Then, of course, 5-7, JT Daniels leaves after the one season and the one game and the injury, and kind of a lackluster 8-4 campaign followed by the truncated season that nobody could really evaluate. So we knew that Clay Helton was on some type of hot seat, but not to what degree. Were you a bit surprised that they didn't just wait to see, okay, how is this season going to land despite the disappointing loss to Stanford, but decided to make a clean break at this point?
Yeah, so just to be clear, I felt, firing him as soon as possible was the right move. It was the right thing to do, but I don't think it was expected. I think it was expected that Mike Bohn would wait a little bit longer, see if there was a bad loss, see if USC failed to handle that Utah, Notre Dame, Arizona State stretch in the middle third of the season. I think that's what most people were expecting, but USC fans were certainly hoping for this. They just weren't expecting it. So, it's really interesting that Mike Bohn has been on the job for 2 years as athletic director. And keep in mind that USC President Carol Folt has not been all that connected to the football program in terms of having her finger on the pulse. She really doesn't seem to understand how important it is for USC football to be elite. Now, her opposition to Urban Meyer, it's well known. It was because of the ugly Zach Smith incident. So, there were legitimate grounds to not want Urban Meyer. But the fact that Clay Helton didn't get fired after 2018, and I know that was before Mike Bohn, that was Lynn Swann, but then he didn't get fired after 2019, that sent a signal that the USC administration, USC leadership really wasn't fully aware of just how, tenuous a situation it had with Clay Helton. And when you saw the Los Angeles Coliseum empty out steadily, it was a steady exodus throughout the second half of that Stanford game. And by the end of the game, there were just like 3,000 people there. And then ESPN picks Oregon, Arizona. That's going to be like a 50-point blowout. When ESPN picks Oregon, Arizona over the Trojans against Oregon State for that 10:30 Eastern, 7:30 Pacific night game on September 25th, that decision came down Monday morning. That might have been like the final straw for Mike Bohn in terms of, you know what, I don't want 50,000 empty seats for these night games. No one's going to come out to watch. So that might have been like the straw that broke the camel's back. Obviously, much bigger factors were in play. The football team playing terribly and donations being down in the athletic department. But the optics certainly matter. And the optics of this past Saturday night were certainly hard to ignore.
We have Matt Zemek on the line here at the Voice of College Football to talk about Clay Helton's firing and possible coaching candidates. USC, of course, blown out by Stanford on Saturday night, a result that surprised me, surprised just about everyone, that a Stanford team that needed the last few minutes of play just to put a touchdown on the board against Kansas State turns around and is up 42-13 in the fourth quarter against USC. That was the biggest shock to me of the weekend, Matt.
Legitimate to say so, because USC's defense under coordinator Todd Orlando had done really well against San Jose State in week one. And San Jose State's not a bunch of chumps. That's the defending Mountain West champion, had an unbeaten regular season. So that was a decent team with a solid offense, well regarded. and USC basically pitched a shutout. I mean, gave up 7 points, but then scored a pick six. So in terms of net points allowed, I call that an adjusted shutout. And so USC looked really solid. And in off-season practices, both spring ball and in August camp, the defense was dominating the offense all the time. And so there was a sense that Todd Orlando on his side of the ball was introducing an aggressive, passionate culture, which is the opposite of Clay Helton. What USC teams have been soft all the way through. I mean, Sam Darnold was just the exception that proved the rule. He masked any deficiencies on that team, was able to carry it to 2 great seasons. But the non-Darnold seasons, USC's been very soft. USC with a 19-14 record, barely above 500 in the 33 games since Darnold left for the pros. So there was a sense in the offseason that while I wasn't buying the USC hype, I thought the Trojans would be 8-4 this year, but there was a legitimate thought process that Todd Orlando on his side of the ball was going to have an aggressive, sound defense that was going to minimize the weaknesses of the offense and maybe buy USC a game or two that it shouldn't win, but the defense was going to bail out the offense. But it turns out, no, Todd Orlando's culture didn't rub off on Clay Helton. It was Clay Helton's culture, a very negative one, which rubbed off on Todd Orlando's defense. That was really the emergent story on Saturday. But given the way the San Jose State game went, you wouldn't have expected that to happen. So I thought USC's offense would have another terrible game, but I did think that the defense was going to lock down Stanford for the reasons you articulated. Stanford was just completely impotent. It's not as though Stanford was necessarily making mistakes, though it certainly made some against Kansas State. They were just impotent. They didn't challenge down the field. They didn't just show any sense of being a threat. And yet here was Stanford gashing USC for an 87-yard touchdown run and making easy pitch and catch completions on 3rd and 6 with no resistance from USC's soft corners. So the Todd Orlando, the idea of a Todd Orlando defensive revolution at USC lasted all of 1 week. It was smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, Matt, to take something that you wove within that dissertation there, I certainly don't want to overgeneralize, but in amongst the great wide receiver core that usually is on the roster year to year, near elite quarterback play, some flashy running backs, some really standout defensive players in pockets, but the sum not being anything that would produce anything close to the standout players that you would think as a whole on defense, that it just hasn't come across in the last several seasons as a very gritty, determined team, a team that will fight through adversity, be poised in the clutch, do the right things to win games.
Absolutely. And one of the things we have to remember here is that, Clay Helton dragged USC down to that 5-7 level in 2018. And so, in a larger contextual sense, Mark, yeah, USC improved in 2019 and 2020, but the bar was so low after 2018. So Clay Helton was able to say, in a technically true way, oh, look, we're improving. But the improvements were slight because the bar was set so low. And especially on defense, you did mention the defensive side of the ball. Clancy Pendergast was the defensive coordinator in 2018 and 2019. And I mean, USC just hit rock bottom on defense under Pendergast. So when Todd Orlando came in 2020, he had a very low bar to clear. So, and because the pandemic, as you noted, makes it hard to evaluate the progress of teams, and especially for a first-year coordinator such as Todd Orlando coming into USC in 2020, yeah, it really was hard to be sure that what he was doing represented a substantial improvement. I mean, he certainly made some slight improvements, but again, USC is not here for slight improvements, from mediocre records. It's here for substantial improvement to an elite standard. And so a number of the players who were expected to be good this season, cornerback Chris Steele, for instance, in the secondary, he had a bad game, and he and other USC players said they didn't have much energy. And how can you have low energy for a Pac-12 conference opener in a make or break season for your head coach? I mean, that kind of says it all. Another big part of Saturday, which was a real point of curiosity and bafflement in the USC camp, Corey Foreman, the #1 recruit in the country, whom the Trojans brought in, he barely played. And he wasn't there was no report that he was injured. He was in a helmet and uniform, ready to play. He did play a few snaps, but he didn't get a large amount of work. And everyone was wondering what the heck Todd Orlando was doing, keeping him largely out of the game. Probably could have used him a little bit more, given how that game went against Stanford.
Dante Williams takes over as interim head coach. Do you think that he has a shot at retaining that position? Number one, I know that a lot of USC people would like to see, because of his recruiting prowess coming in from Oregon, that that maybe that's the way to go. Certainly the athletic director outlined that there's going to be a national coaching search. You would think that they would be going for a big name, and a lot of big names are typically on the list across the country.
Yeah, so I think Dante Williams' ceiling is defensive coordinator. I think if he wants to stay at USC and, as you noted, be the rock star recruiter on that staff, which he is. He's one of the top 2 recruiters in the Pac-12. He and one of Mario Cristobal's chief lieutenants at Oregon. They're the top 2 assistant coach recruiters in the Pac-12 in terms of the number of stars and the number of recruits they've pulled in for the past few classes. If he wants to stay at USC, I think his ceiling is on the new staff under the new head coach is defensive coordinator. He will not be the head coach. The USC needs a proven head coach. Maybe a rock star offensive coordinator whom can be paired with an elite defensive coordinator. Maybe, but USC would have to be very specific and selective if it goes that route. But we're very likely to see another head coach become the new head coach at USC. And you can't give the keys to an unproven guy. That's the Clay Helton lesson. That's part of the whole story. Mike Bohn would face a lot of scrutiny, and he would be criticized and questioned a lot if he brought in someone with very little head coaching experience. So I'm sure you want to get into the list of candidates. I think that, the super duper stars, they're not going to take it. I think that like Chris Peterson, Bob Stoops, they're done with coaching in my mind. I don't think they're going to coach a single game again. They got chewed up and spat out by the grind of coaching. They didn't want to be lifers the way Nick Saban is, the way Joe Paterno was. I think they're out. But you should call them. Mike Bohn should definitely give them a call to see if they're interested. But I think they're out. I think they're done. So in terms of the realistic top tier candidates who might say yes, like that's really where an athletic director has to focus in terms of being ready to vet candidates, being able to ask some tough questions in the interview and drill deep and get the right guy for USC. So I think that the top of the list are 2 guys in particular. Luke Fickell of Cincinnati, who Mike Bohn knows well from Cincinnati. They have a relationship there, a working relationship there. And Matt Campbell of Iowa State. Now, will they say yes? An athletic director has to be ready to expect whether a candidate will say yes or not and what the probability is. I'm not sure. Both Fickell and Campbell are well known as being guys who like being in the Midwest and might be waiting for an open job. Campbell in particular might be waiting to see Jim Harbaugh take a tumble at Michigan so he can step into that vacancy if it emerges. So I'm not sold on the idea that they're going to say yes, but I think there's a distinct possibility because it would definitely be a dramatic move up. It would be a splashy, great job for either of those guys to have. So I think they go to the top of the list as realistic candidates with a shot of saying yes. James Franklin of Penn State's a really fascinating choice here because I'm not sure whether James Franklin is tired of being in the same division as Ohio State or if he looked at how poorly coached the Buckeyes were this past Saturday against Oregon, and maybe he's thinking, you know what, I can solve the Ohio State problem. I can solve this puzzle. Ohio State's going down. Ryan Day is not as good as we thought. Justin Fields was carrying him the past few years. I can overtake Ohio State. I can become king of the Big Ten. Maybe that's what James Franklin's thinking, but I don't know. So it's really James Franklin is one of those guys where I'm 50-50. I have no feel for whether he'd want to leave Penn State or stay there and try to become, king of Happy Valley. That's a really fascinating profile. And then, just to give a different example, there are some coaches who, in my mind, would instantly come if asked. That doesn't mean they should be at the top of Mike Bohn's list. They should be 6 or 7 spots down the list, but they would come instantly, no questions asked. I think of PJ Fleck. I think if you asked him, zoom, he'd be there. He'd sign on the dotted line, no question. So it's just kind of interesting to see which coaches would instantly say no. Like Mario Cristobal, he would say no. He's not going to give this job a second thought. He's happy at Oregon. The only 2 jobs he'd leave Oregon for are Alabama and Miami. Alabama's not open. Miami, the way Manny Diaz is coaching that program, that could come open at the end of the year. But Cristobal will not leave Oregon for USC. That's a 0% chance. It's a non-starter. So there are like your 0% chances. There are your maybes, such as Fickell and Campbell. And then there are guys like James Franklin, where I don't really have a feel yet for what they might do. But obviously, Franklin and some other guys in his position, should certainly get a look from Mike Bohn in the coming months.
Franklin, Campbell, and Fickell seem to fit a prototype for me that works both from the standpoint of them being reasonable, but also being optimal for USC. And that's that they're still young enough to have that burning desire, that fire, that energy, because recruiting and coaching is a grind. As you mentioned, Chris Peterson, he got burned out at Washington, let alone the pressure at USC. Bob Stoops, of course, had a long and lengthy career at Oklahoma. Those guys are obviously accomplished and capable, but do they have that fire and that desire to get out there and really grind like you need to maintain and retain all that talent in California that's been slipping away, and one of the reasons why Clay Helton is no longer employed. So between Fickell, Franklin, and Campbell, to varying degrees, they seem to be in that right range of they've achieved enough to show that they can build a program and hold down a big job to varying degrees, especially Franklin and Penn State. But they're also not that old to where they still seem in that young and energetic state where this could be the job that they land that builds their legacy. And they're all 3 to varying degrees. We don't know what their internal aspirations are, but to land that job that is, hey, I've arrived. This is the job where I can accomplish all my goals and dreams. Here's the facility, the brand, the image, the tradition, everything where I can really accomplish and go to the mountaintop.
Absolutely. I think in terms of drilling deeper on those 3 candidates, let's look at Fickell and Franklin in particular. One thing about them is that they've had, Fickell in particular, he's a defense-first coach. And his Cincinnati offense did not look very good against Kirby Smart in Georgia in the Peach Bowl. And Mike Denbrock is his offensive coordinator at Cincinnati. And then James Franklin, Penn State did beat Wisconsin, but it's not as though its offense looked good. Penn State should have a much better offense than what it has. And you look at Franklin's tenure at Penn State, when he had Joe Moorhead as offensive coordinator, developing Saquon Barkley, developing Trace McSorley, okay, everything came together. But without Moorhead as his offensive coordinator, Franklin's Penn State offenses have been pretty weak. So if I'm Mike Bohn, if I interview Fickell and Franklin in particular, I am demanding they get a significant upgrade at offensive coordinator. And of course, not just an offensive coordinator they wish to hire, but Fickell and Franklin would need to tell Mike Bohn, yes, that my first choice is going to agree to come with me to USC. If asked, like it can't be a maybe. It needs to be a yes, I know this guy and he will be part of my team. Mike Bohn needs to get those answers. I say this because even the head coaching hire might make sense on a general level, but you need that opposite coordinator to be really strong. If like Fickell's a defense first guy, you need to make sure that his offensive plan and philosophy are sound. Look at Washington. A very instructive example here in terms of hiring a head coach. Like Jimmy Lake, it was felt he deserved the job. He deserved the promotion to replace Chris Peterson. He was an excellent defensive coordinator for Washington, helped Peterson grow that program, become very successful. So like he earned the job, but in terms of hiring him, you needed to have a good offensive plan. You needed to make sure that his idea of a good offensive coordinator was, legitimate. And it wasn't. John Donovan, no one wanted John Donovan. Only Jimmy Lake did. And so Washington Athletic Director Jen Cohen obviously either didn't ask the right questions, didn't ask enough questions, or she just didn't care about what Jimmy Lake's offensive plan was. And that's a mistake. So hiring Lake wasn't the problem. Hiring Lake without getting a good offensive plan, that was the problem at Washington. So if Mike Bohn considers Luke Fickell or James Franklin, he has to nail down the offensive plan and philosophy and make sure that the coordinator is big league. The offensive coordinator is big league and can work with Fickell and Franklin to maximize USC's talent and resources.
It's a great point. You look at the gold standard in college football right now with Nick Saban as a defensive backs coach, innately, and he's a defensive-minded guy who now is working on his another NFL head coach as an offensive coordinator in Bill O'Brien, following Steve Sarkisian, following Lane Kiffin, all three strong personalities, and obviously strong enough as offensive gurus to hold down that job and counter his defensive prowess. Absolutely. Matt Zemek's on the line from Trojans Wire, breaking down the USC football landscape for us following the firing of Clay Helton. So you get a lot of feedback from the fans who, and now aside from the ridiculous fantasy selections out there, who would be the realistic front runner from the fan base? Who would they want that's realistic?
Fickell and Campbell would both be very well received. And here's the thing: USC fans, after seeing Clay Helton for 6 years, they just want competence, And when you watch football teams, college or pro, you identify who's well coached. You identify which teams understand what to do, where to be, just the basics. You know that a team and a coaching staff get it, or when they don't. And Clay Helton's teams clearly didn't get it. So Fickell and Campbell, they just are very competent head coaches. Like their style of offense, style of play, I don't know if you can easily recognize it the same way you can recognize the way like Mike Leach coaches offense, or the way other coaches go about their business. But they're competent. They're highly competent. So they would be really well received. In terms of other names, one name I heard was Boston College coach Jeff Hafley. And that's an interesting case because, Boston College's quarterback just went down, got injured, knocked out. So Boston College might not be that good, but, Hafley had that team in position to make a real rise in the ACC this year. That's a name that's been tossed about. Another interesting name, not a name I think that's going to get a lot of play, but, Mike Bohn had been at Colorado. Eric Bieniemy has been mentioned by more than a few USC fans in my Twitter mentions. And I understand why. Like, he's a great offensive mind, great X and O guy. The problem is he hasn't been a head coach. And again, USC can't really risk it with a guy who doesn't have collegiate head coaching experience, unless there's a real good exception to that rule. And so because Bieniemy's gone on this NFL track so consistently, if you throw him then into the college game, would he be ready for all the things that are part of a college head coach's job? You would have to ask yourself questions about whether he could do that. So it brings up so many uncertainties and the risks attached. But that's a name I've heard from a number of USC fans over the past 24 hours. It's interesting to see which names other than Fickell, Campbell, Franklin are emerging as alternate choices. It's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out.
Please like the video, share these videos out on social media, because if you enjoy the content, others will as well, and subscribe right here at the Voice of College Football. Join Matt, his obvious insight and knowledge into the USC football program and across the Pac-12 and the nation, again, is obvious. Join him on Trojans Wire. USC's been through this interim coach situation a few times in the last decade already, and they typically step up and maybe not exceed expectations by any stretch, because they've always got talent on the roster, and especially in a division that is void of elite programs. It looked like it was already going to be a dogfight between the likes of USC, Utah, UCLA, figuring a little more prominently than we expected, in Arizona State. So, the season's not necessarily lost, although I'm sure a lot of people are writing it off as, championship or bust. They're probably not that good, but this team could still pull it together and get to the Pac-12 championship game.
Absolutely. You look at what's happening in the Pac-12 South. Utah lost to BYU. Arizona State has looked well below average in its first few games. I think the final score of that UNLV game was 37-14, but that was a close game midway through the third, and UNLV is horrible. So Arizona State has a lot of work to do. So you could get a situation where USC, Utah, Arizona State, they all finish with a 6-3 record in the 9-game Pac-12 schedule. USC wins the tiebreaker and gets to the Pac-12 title game with either a 9-3 or 8-4 record. That does seem to be the ceiling for the Trojans this season. So yeah, and of course, 8-4 and a Pac-12 South title. I think under the circumstances, Dante Williams would probably take that at this point. And I think what makes this complicated, though, for USC is precisely that you can't count on the defense now. I think certainly after the San Jose State game, there was a sense that the offense is going to struggle this year, but the defense is going to be there as the anchor, the presence of stability and continuity. But now you really can't count on that. So I think the thing that Dante Williams could bring to USC is, because he's such a good recruiter, because he has such a good rapport with players, and because his emphasis is on the defensive side of the ball, I think his task is to make that defense, working with Todd Orlando, to make that defense the best it can be. If he can improve that defense, I think the offense is it's on its own island. And Graham Harrell was an air raid coach, so it was his show. Clay Helton gave him the keys. So Graham Harrell is going to try to muddle through on offense. I don't think you're going to see significant improvement there. But I think USC's upside, to the extent that it can be developed, it's on defense under Dante Williams. And if that happens, maybe USC can win a few 17-13 rock fights against Utah and Arizona State offenses, which certainly have their share of vulnerabilities right now. That's probably the best case scenario in terms of how USC negotiates the rest of this season.
Matt Zemek, Trojans Wire, breaking down the USC Trojan situation following the firing of Clay Helton. Matt, we appreciate you stopping by and breaking things down for us.
Mark, thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun.